All right. Am I good?
It's just interesting when you said, you happy with me just pressing record and then we can get into it? It's so interesting because I've gotten such a relationship with having no fucking idea what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But yet having some idea of what I don't have an idea about enough that I'm like, all right. So that's interesting right there, you know.
Yeah.
It's this kind of weird trusting and the unknown, just having it's like this domain. It's a strange domain of trusting what you don't know what's going to happen, but you've had enough experiences like that such that have just turned out more than you could have ever planned on.
Yes.
That was in that. Sure, yeah, just let's do it.
Yeah. It is interesting, isn't it? Because you are stepping into the unknown, and you know it's the unknown, and anything could come out of it. But there's a familiarity with that process, at least, of taking that leap.
Yeah. This is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Is just that sense in which, and I think there's a bunch of different ways you can get at it, but the way I've been thinking about it lately is it seems to me, and I can't think of a situation or a moment where it's not valid and possible to ask yourself, what am I not seeing right now? Or what am I not hearing right now? Or what am I not understanding? Or even you could say, like, if in a conversation, what's unsaid, right? Like what's remained silent. And it's interesting because it seems to me that no matter what, I may or may not have an answer to that question. However, I can always ask. And if I do have an answer to it, it's going to be just, no matter what it is, it's whatever the answer is, I can just ask the same questions, right? Yes. So there's something inexhaustible about that domain or dimension that those questions presuppose, right? But I think my question is, or what strikes me about that, is just that that's possible, right? It seems to me that we are in fact open to that domain, right? And in that it's always the case. I can always ask it, right? That seems to indicate that it's whatever it is, it's something that constitutes every moment, right? It's part of the way the moment sustains itself, is this domain, in that it can always ask that, and it's inexhaustible, right? So the question I have, I think, is, in some sense, in what way is that domain? How do I know it's there? Right? Like, how do I know it's there? Like, how do I understand that? Like, and everyone understands that, right? Because by virtue of which everything in the domain that I do know about and that I am saying stuff about, at some point was from that domain. At some point, you go further enough back in time, all of it came out of that domain. And at some point in the future, everything I'm looking at will be out of that domain. Yes. Right. So yet that the domain itself it's not clear to me how I understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so fascinating to follow that thread of how is this domain presenting itself in this moment, and how can I bring more of that domain here? Because there is a sense in which we can close off or open to that domain. And to me, it feels like there's safety and predictability in closing off to the domain, but also a deadness and a staleness that comes with that. And in choosing to open more to the domain, there's a uncertainty and an insecurity that comes with that choice. Yeah. But along with that comes an aliveness and a certain type of energy that is unavailable without access to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, in some sense, because remind me again, don't you live in a, is it an ashram? What is it that are you still there? Is that what you're doing, or?
Yeah, it's an ashram of sorts. It's not like a traditional ashram in the sense of monks sitting around meditating all day and reading scripture and that kind of thing. It's a more modernized, open community of spiritual practitioners. And these spiritual practitioners all exist in the marketplace, so run their own businesses, have jobs, have families, houses, kids, dogs, what have you. The kind of, I guess, the traditional Western model of what life is. But then in addition to that, there are regular meetings and there are rituals that are intended to aid the spiritual practice and the spiritual endeavor. And we have a spiritual teacher. His name is Vishrant. And it's in a way, in a sense, and this is the sense that I get, it's a blending of kind of Western living with Eastern mysticism and philosophy, and attempting to develop wisdom in the merging of both.
Yeah. And you live there with your partner, correct?
My wife, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, with your wife. Okay, got it. Interesting. And so does it, and there's, how many people are all at that level where you're at, living together?
There's about 30 of us in the full-time Sangha. And then there's about 6 to 10, I would say, casual attendees that will drop in and out. And we also have some online attendees as well that will join meetings online.
Right. And you've been doing that for how long?
Since 2016 full-time, so nearly 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So 5 years later. I'm just curious.
Later.
You're kind of like been living, in some sense, an experiment.
Yes.
Yeah. So 5 years later, what do you think so far?
5 years later.
That was a committed breath you took right
there. Yeah. So the breath is wow, that's a profound question, and I have no idea how to answer this question.
Yeah.
Because it is an experiment, and to me, the experiment is as fresh today as it was 5 years ago. And to try and describe what transformation has taken place within me and what transformation has taken place without and in my kind of worldview is very difficult to do. I mean, I can point at certain things. I feel like I am more open to experience now than I was previously. Yeah. I feel like I value connection with people much more, and friendships and relationships on a deeper in a deeper way than I did before. I feel like I no longer see the world through the paradigm of I must acquire material wealth and accumulate that in order to find contentment sometime in the future, in retirement, let's say. I don't see the world that way anymore. So there's a different way of seeing the world, which is more what's happening now. You know, what are we doing now, and what's the best way to live. But in terms of the mystery that was there 5 years ago, the mystery is still here now, just as palpably as it was. And the more deeper I get into the mystery, the more I realize I don't know what the mystery is or what it is that I'm seeking. Really, I can talk about it, but it's really like it goes deep.
So the it goes deep in the mystery, and you said a couple of words, the freshness, right? That so the experiment is just as fresh as it was the first day I came in. I'm wondering if that openness that you're talking about, right, is in some sense like the very thing that I was just asking about.
Yes, it more than likely is exactly that very thing. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'm asking, perhaps a good person, since they're dwelling within what happens basically if me and my wife just set up shop right in the center of that thing, right?
Yeah. What happens?
I kind of just said that rhetorically, but I'm glad that you actually I'm like, let's go. Yeah,
what does happen?
Yeah.
Really, what does happen?
Yeah.
Because
there's some way in which, I mean, even the thing that you just said, right? Like that my orientation, right, has shifted. Like the orientation shift, right? And it does seem something like the Western orientation itself kind of shifted in you, right? Which is where I'm headed is I already know in advance, in some sense, right, what the goal is, right? And it's attainable. It's like more of a having mode.
Yeah,
right?
That's exactly right.
And so that's shifted such that I'm not actually looking. That's not the goal of my life right now.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. That's fallen away. Does it feel like it's fallen away? And that you just kind of find when you look, you're like, oh, I'm no longer doing that. Like without even thinking about that, I'm not doing that. Right. Is it kind of like that? Or is it that's something that you've like beat yourself over the head with, and that you're like your teacher like whacked you over the head 3 times and
it's not completely fallen away. What I would say is it comes and goes. So I will oscillate between the having mode and the being mode, right? Yeah. But my preference has shifted dramatically from my preference being very much the having mode, and really that being all I knew, to my preference being the being mode. And I notice when it is that I find myself drifting back into the having mode, and I am goal orientated and outcome orientated, it brings a sense of dissatisfaction with it. It's like, this isn't as nice as just being open and present and being with what is. There's some tension and some um, some uncomfortable urgency to it.
Mhm. Yeah, it struck me that just that seems a difference to a place. It harkens back to, I think it was actually I think it was Jordan Hall I was talking to about this a little bit. What I heard you say was what's shifted, right? I still struggle, right,
Yes.
with it.
Yes.
However, I find myself desiring the being mode,
Yes.
right,
Yes.
versus the having mode.
Yes.
And it struck me as you were talking that, well, just right there, that desire seems like a different. I don't even know if it's the same ballpark, right? Of to desire a modal,
Yes.
right? A modal, mode of being
Yes.
versus desiring an object,
Yeah.
right? Like, well, just right there, just the fact that the telos is one of a mode. What is it? It's in some sense, I guess is the question in there, like what is the difference between desiring something, right? And desiring to be in a mode such that in the different modes, something even occurs different as something in some sense.
Yes.
Yeah. That seems like a shift right there.
Yes. Yes.
To have a modal tracking and a modal telos, right? To desire that's different than desiring something, which is really striking to me.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
And even as you reflect that back, it's like the desire for the being mode is still a desire that creates discontentment in me. So if I'm not what I perceive to be in the being mode, then
Bad boy.
Sorry, I missed that.
Bad boy.
Bad boy. Yeah. Yes, there is a judgment on myself of I'm doing it wrong. Yeah.
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 Yeah, totally. So what you're saying is like, even when I don't want something, I can take that non-something and make it something to reify. And all the same samsaric principles apply. I can suffer just as much if I make a mode an object.
Yes, exactly right. I can just shift the object of desire and it's still bang right into the same stuff. It's still goal orientated, it's still outcome orientated, and there it is.
Right. Yeah. So that right there, that awareness of that it's like that. Would it, just kind of following the same, using an analogy, right? This is an analogy, but like when you first came into the school, right? Would you say that your awareness of that experience of that I can turn anything into, even my spiritual practice, into like a samsaric, right, thing to suffer about? Like, has that kind of awareness deepened as you've dwelled in the practice? Like, would you say, like, for example, are you aware of it when you're stuck in that kind of suffering, probably more quickly or more attuned to it? Yeah, than you were.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Just thinking about all the traps, right? The traps and the mind fucks, right? That are so like you can like when you're meditating and maybe you haven't thought for an hour, and then all of a sudden you just subtly notice, and you're like, you don't hear yourself say, oh my God, I have not thought for an hour, right? Like, fact, I'm hardly thinking at all in my life. Clearly, I'm enlightened, and boy, and of course, I'm the first one to see it, but I'm surprised no one else has noticed how enlightened I am. In fact, and then 5 years later, like you come to it, like,
yeah.
and in that sense, there's so that just that phenomena, right, of like, in the Eastern traditions, right, where it's very much about noting internal minding activity, right, and noticing it, right, noticing it, and in noticing it, there's something that happens there, right,
yes.
and just keep noticing that, and as you kind of, in some sense, it's like a net. You start to get more what isn't that implicitly by noticing when you're stuck in the other thing, right? Something opens up there, right?
Yes.
The more that you do that, I think a lot of people say the more that you do that, you really it starts to become obvious,
Yeah.
right? In some sense, that very little of that thinking that you've been dedicating so much time doing, right, is actually needed, right?
Yes.
And that as that starts to happen, the real itself, you start to realize, is the very thing that all that thinking is wanted ultimately, but the grasping after, right, makes it impossible. So since that kind of insidious activity starts to subside in some sense, right, what's real becomes, is the word given, how would you say it, like, in those moments, some of that sense, yeah,
becomes salient.
say it again. Salient. Oh, that's a good word. Yeah. So this, it strikes me in some sense that ultimately, that which becomes salient, right? That because it's interesting, because it can't be represented, right? It can't be owned, right? It can't be, in some sense, a thought, like in the neurotic way of thinking about thoughts, right? In fact, any amount of that habituating sense actually turns it into the very thing that it's pushing away what it's ultimately wanting or seeking, but can't conceive of.
Yes.
Right? In some sense, that which becomes salient seems to be all the things that we could say are things like this. It's like, what is that I cannot reify? What is that can't be represented? What is that can't be owned, right, by me? It's very similar kind of to these questions of like, what am I not seeing right now?
Yes.
What is it that?
Yes.
Like I'm just getting the connection in the way, how does it show itself or disclose itself to me, right? Even if I'm not, if it doesn't look at me right in the face or something like that, right? There's a way in which it's present, even constituting, right? But unheard often.
Yes.
Right. And then you were talking about like, yeah, and that openness to it, one is not easy. And the tendency is to actually to close to it.
That's right.
Right.
Yes.
Right. But yet the more you close to it, the more dead one becomes.
Yes.
And I would say strangely, if we look at this in terms of vulnerability or permeability, right, and transparency, right, it's funny. This is the paradox I see all the time, like in circling, because so much about it is in some senses um, practicing
Yes.
vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
Almost like a virtue in some sense,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And there's a paradox in there because, well, one, yeah, I've said this before, but it's so funny. Like in all the years that I've been teaching, right, and doing courses and stuff like this, right? Like not once have I ever said to somebody, suggested, hey, you may want to be vulnerable right now. I've like never heard anybody go, well, I'm glad someone said it, right? I'm so relieved that I get to be, that's all. I just get to be vulnerable. It's more like, no, it's like, it's like they just kind of quake in their boots or something, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
But there's a paradox in there because the moment, and this is why it's something worthy of practicing as a virtue, right? Which is when I voluntarily become vulnerable and I undefend,
Mhm.
right? There's a paradox in there, right? Um, versus the alternative is something like, well, if I defend myself, right, and I put a shell around myself, is the moment I, by virtue of that shell, become brittle,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So there's a strange thing about this sense of like, yeah, in that shellhood, right, in that egg that I put around myself, so that I don't have to experience the discomfort of the pain or whatever it is the moment I become uh, uh, brittle. I can begin I become breakable in some sense.
Yes.
And the
Yes.
paradox is it's the sense in which, well, when you voluntarily move towards whatever it is, saying the truth, right, opening up to what I don't yet understand, right, and doing it voluntarily is the moment that there, there's there's less and less to break,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's almost as if through the process of defending oneself, you are forming an identity that is solid, and that solidness can be hurt, can experience pain.
yeah,
And in the relaxing of the defense systems, in the opening up and the being vulnerable, the identity becomes more fluid and more intangible. And you're more able to flow with life and dance and move as things present. And so there's less brittleness because there's not something solid that can break. It's
yeah,
just like things are
yeah.
happening. Things
Right,
are moving.
right,
Yeah.
right. It's interesting because it's, there's also, I noticed there's something, even there's another paradox in there, right? I guess it's something like, tell me what comes up for you with this. Like that very, if we say on some level, what you've been practicing and dwelling inside of is the practice of becoming someone in which you're more likely to go, unknown, right? And less likely, hopefully, to go, right?
Yes.
And what I would imagine what afforded that very practice of opening, in some sense, was given by there's a there's buildings, there's repetitive practices that you get up and do. There's like in some sense, I guess dwelling there means in some sense dwelling in the practice, in
Yeah.
the structures and the traditions and having a teaching and all of those things that in some sense are um, are in some domain of the known,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes. Yeah, and that's paradoxical too in a way. And what it brings to mind is John Vervaeke's four Ps. Like there's propositions that can be said to you, as in this is how life works, and this is what you'll notice when you look. Then there's procedural knowings, which is this is how you meditate, this is how you practice openness. Then there's perspectival knowings, in that you can observe from different people's viewpoint what life is like for them, how life is presenting for them, and that's present in the teaching, in the don't know the word for it, in the overall sense, the gestalt. And then there's a participatory experiential knowing, which can't actually be given to someone. You can't reach that place through a set of propositions. It has to be your direct experience through interacting with life and noticing what the experience of openness is like, and what the experience of defendedness is like, and what the experience of the being mode and the having mode, being present or being stuck in repetitive thought, all these different things. And then hopefully cultivating wisdom through that participatory knowing, and living your life in a way that engenders peace and clarity and heart.
Totally. Appreciating just the kind of the way that you're just kind of walking through that. And I was noticing as you're doing that, one of those moments where I was like, at least for me, there's a sense in which, oh, the very thing that we're talking about is the very thing that's happening.
Yeah.
Like the sense of like the flow of the conversation feels very easy. I'm kind of lost track of time, right? There's a sense in which I'm very present to what I don't know. I'm in an attuned relationship to it somehow. Like it feels like in some sense where I'm beyond what I could just think on my own, right? And that we're both starting to respond to something or conform to something together, right? Dialogos.
Absolutely. Yes. And what a beautiful.
Or how would you describe it?
Yeah, that's exactly that. You described it beautifully. And there's a flow state there, and it is dialogos. It's what John Vervaeke is pointing to when he uses that term. There's something. There's a third entity emerging through the conversation that neither you or I can grasp totally. It is its own thing, and we're both contributing to its emergence. And it feels like the energy in me right now is like expansive, and wow, this is really nice to be a part of, and I want to serve it. I want to do more of it.
There's an it we're in. And would you say that you're pointing to the very participatory modal experience of presence, right? Of what's presence, right? I think that's the way John talks about it, right? Like it's the participative knowing where you get the sense of presence that comes, you get a contactfulness, right?
Yes, and the way John talks about the flow state, and Csikszentmihalyi talks about the flow state, which is the difficulty of the task matching with the skillfulness of the task, so that the skill is high and the difficulty is high, and then everything kind of drops away and you're just with what's unfolding, and you lose track of time and you drop into flow, and you're just present. Like I'm just tuned into you when you're talking. I'm just listening to you and not really worrying about what comes next. It's like, let's just be with this now. And it emerges naturally.
Yes. And this was happening. This is one of the things that's so striking to me about these things. It's like never gets old, is this experience of, and this that is happening was already happening before I noticed it. I found we find ourselves here, right? Like, like on some level, I can't really quite account for it in some traditional sense of the word, right? To make it happen or something. There's something that like through we are we find ourselves dwelling in it and it indwelling in us, right?
Yes.
But that dwelling is what is precisely what you come into recognize. You recognize it, right? And by virtue of it, right?
Yes.
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 Yeah,
Absolutely.
totally.
Absolutely. But there is a way in which we can increase the likelihood of that occurring in being open to the conversation and in being present and open to the unknown during the conversation.
Yeah.
To me, gives that much more likelihood of it showing itself.
Yeah.
So there is a way in which you can attune yourself to that.
Yes. Yes. And that likely of showing itself, right? Is showing itself as it happens. So this is so fun. Like the this brings us back to the very beginning of the conversation when we started doing, like, I started to bring up what I've been thinking about. It's on some level, I would imagine that the way it shows itself or makes that dimension that's always in some sense available to us, right, at any moment, and in that sense almost maybe constituting, sustaining the moment itself, right, is the whole domain of what I didn't know that I didn't know, and I didn't understand that I didn't understand, but yet somehow, even though all of that, I can still, it can still address me and I can still address it, but yet I can't really quite tell you how I represent it, right, to myself.
Yes.
But at some level, it seems so deep that it is the most determinate of myself and of the moment and of all of these things. And so when you said when it shows itself, it seems like in some sense, maybe what was my relationship to it, I guess is the question, before it showed itself. Because there's this quality that's just so interesting to me about this. It's a repeated experience of it. It's like when it shows itself, there's this quality of, oh, that's right. Oh, that's right. Duh. Like it was here the whole time, right?
Yeah.
Now and oftentimes that feeling is in fact, a lot of times that feeling, I don't have any historical reference for that experience. I've never experienced it before. However, the feeling, the way it seems to disclose itself is like, oh, that's right. Right? Like, oh, I just forgot for a second.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
So that I think that feeling of remembrance, right, I think is telling to the way in which out of the corner of my eye, or it when it's concealed, that there's a way that we are already in relationship to that concealment.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not one of anything that I can be clear about or something like that. It seems to be like a ground level, like an ontological constituting level of an orientation that we're always in, that we can kind of find. It can reveal itself, but also conceal itself in another way. This kind of revealing, concealing, this aletheia sense of where truth comes from, the revelation or the unconcealment of the concealed, right?
Yeah. Is there a time in your life or a moment in your life where you remember the first time you had an experience of this, or the first time you had a reference point for what this is?
question. Well, what comes to mind, I don't know if this is answering your question, but what just came to mind was there was this kind of strange period of time when I was a kid. Like, I think I was probably like 5 or 6 or something like that, where it's kind of difficult to describe, where somehow I just found myself noticing that there were a couple different perspectives, right? There was like the perspective that my parents and my grandma and the adults, let's say the adults had. And I noticed that I sometimes could catch a glimpse of it and get their perspective, right? But then but then when afterwards, I would be like, it'd go away, and I didn't know how I got it, right? And I remember being like, it was this game between. I would literally do this in a sense where I'd like spend all day seeing if I can make myself have the perspective that the adults took, right? And it would be this experience of like where, oh, I could get it for a second and then I'd lose it, right?
Yeah.
I did. And it's similar to something like those Gestalt ink drawing images, right? Where if you look at it one way, it's like a concave square, another way it's protruding, kind of, it shows itself different. It's kind of that same feeling.
Yes.
And I would see, and then I would go, okay, I found it. And then I see how long I could like hold it, but then it would fall back out, right? And I just remember a vague period of time. It was so interesting. And it had this quality. I think I remember trying to describe that what I was doing to my dad or my grandpa, and how the hell I could barely describe it now. I'm sure it wasn't successful, right? So there was this kind of awareness though that they didn't know what was going on regarding that, and I couldn't tell them, but there was this knowing, this strange knowing, this kind of almost equanimous knowing through it. That's so interesting. Trying to put this to words. It's like that one day I would just have the perspective that they're having, and I would probably forget my own, right? And I think what it was, like when I think back to it, my perspective was something like everything was a who. Because I remember that. I remember like I would have conversations with trees and with rocks, and everything presented itself with a character that somehow kind of talked, and I could just take that and go in my imagination with it. And my grandfather loved this about me. Like he would just, and I spent a lot of time with my grandfather, and in some sense, he was kind of like that.
Yeah.
But no one really quite understood him. And I just sensed that there was some kind of special relationship. So he would just go on my ride, right? Whatever it was, right? He would just do it, right? And so there's a way where I think my grandfather really did kind of in a very private, unexplicit way, supported this imaginative part of me, right? But yeah, it would be like my perspective was like everything talked to me, everything had a character, right? And the adult perspective was something like things would in some sense, lose their personality and just be kind of a dimension or something, like just be a number or a thing or something like that, right?
Yes.
So I remember and I don't know if this is addressing your original, I forgot what your original question was, but like something about just that period of time was, I think was in some sense a way that I remember consciously contending with that thing that we're attempting to talk about now.
Yeah. It reminds me, what you're describing reminds me of the I it versus the I thou. And as a kid, you had an I thou relationship with everything. Everything was a thou, and that's how you saw it. And the adults had an I it perspective where everything was an object to be manipulated and controlled. And you had a sense that I am going to one day lose the I thou and move to an I it. But how beautiful that your grandfather recognized that quality in you and fostered it.
Yes.
And allowed that to emerge and percolate in you and come forth. That's so magnificent.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to thank you for saying that and seeing that, because that is really, and as he died when I was 17, and I I never got the feeling he died. And that's always struck me, right? I used to think like, did I just suppress that, or like, but I don't think so. I think I think it shows the way he has always lived for me.
Yeah.
Like very, very proximal, very close in. It was almost like um we were in on a secret.
Yeah. Yeah.
That no
Yes.
one even had to say that
Yeah.
we were. Like we didn't even have to acknowledge it to ourselves, right? Something like that.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. And there's like a sense in which there are others that are also in on the secret.
Mhm.
You know, philosophers like Heidegger and Heraclitus and you know, these people that are trying to articulate what being is, they're also in on the secret, and they're touching into this um, inexhaustible quality. But it's so difficult, well, it's impossible to contain and present logically in language, that that secret is often dismissed and not valued, and we just continue living our lives as we always have done. The culture continues as the culture will continue. And yeah, that secret, that inexhaustibleness seems to me to be so sacred, so profound, so important, that it supersedes everything else. Like if we can train ourselves to be in contact with that and to serve that, then life takes on a different quality, a beautiful quality, a deep quality, a true quality that is unlike anything else.
Yeah. As you were talking about Heraclitus saying that, I noticed you were looking in some sense, or feeling into something and saying it. As I had this sense, I kind of got the quality. I was like, oh yeah, but that's a little bit what he probably looked like. It's probably going like this. Yeah. That sense of, well, I'll ask you, that thing that you were and Heraclitus and we are trying to sound out, if you will. It seems like that sounding out is a response to hearing something, right?
Mm.
Like, and there's this way in which, these thinkers try to, in some sense, try to bring into language, right? In other words, come to terms, right, with what they're hearing. And in some sense, they're bringing it into language as they're going. But it's not like that they're have an opinion and they're saying it. It's more like there's this thing they're responding to. They're in a response to something.
Yes.
That, what would you say, like that sense? Like, I think I saw it, your eyes were like, you know what I'm talking about? It was just now as you were describing that.
I do.
Yeah.
I don't know. The answer is I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
I would like to know, and I love exploring that mystery, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah. It's a very peculiar not known. It's a very interesting thing you don't know.
Mm. Mm.
Because I think, is it fair to say, you don't know it enough, or you don't know it in just the right way, such that you can move yourself and your wife into a into a into a into a like a concentrated practice in some sense to listen to it, right?
Yes, yes, that is true. There is well, the way I experience it is a curiosity and an excitement that comes with uh, just having tiny glimpses of it. If I get a glimpse of it, that makes my day, like for a
Mhm.
split second. And if I
Yeah,
can be there for 10 minutes or an hour, then that's just phenomenal, right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
in a sense, I live for that.
yeah,
But yeah, so in order to make a decision like committing oneself to a spiritual community that is attempting to do things like this, there needs to be some kind of motivator. And for me, part of that motivator was the curiosity and the excitement that I felt in starting to discover some of this. It was like, wow,
yeah,
this is
yeah.
whatever this is, it's worthy of my time and energy.
Yes. And I get this. What I'm hearing in that is there's no deliberation with yourself about it. It's like there's something about the experience of it that just you're like, okay, whatever. Let's just like make everything about that. Let's just
Yeah.
like throw the whole thing
Yeah.
out and the right thing in or whatever. Let's just do get closer to that.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. There's a trust in that.
Yeah. And you said like, and it's a curiosity. It's like you're curious about it. So this is kind of a strange question, I think. From well, if you feel into the curiosity, and I would even say that what you're talking about, I think to me strikes me as more wonder, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, in that, in the sense in which increasing the intimacy with it is actually desirable, right? It's inhaling a good. Where curiosity is more like you increase that and it's too much or something, right?
Mm.
So in that sense, but where okay, so I think the question is where is it that the wonder or curiosity, whose is it?
Mm.
Like, is it something upon, like, on one level, we could say that, I mean, the common sense way of saying, just answering that question would be like, oh, well, there's this that I'm responding to, and then there's my experience of it, and then from my experience, I find myself curiosity arising,
Mm.
right? Um, However, I'm wondering if that's actually, I from what you're talking about, I'm not hearing much of a distinction between the this, right, and the wonder itself about it. Like
Yeah.
I can't get the sense of like it seems to be either between both of you. It seems to be either it and the way it's something like then the wonder seizes you and you find yourself like, you know, drooling at the opportunity to just even not know anything about it, but be something like that, right? So I guess the question is like by who at who's wonder who's in wonder here,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, 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 yeah. So when you said the word seize, that really resonated with me because it is as though I am seized by it. And so I have to put words to the experience from my side. So curiosity, excitement are the attempt at that. But you're right. It is as though I'm being pulled by it. and I'm just responding to the pulling. It's not voluntary on my behalf, and it's not something I'm doing. It's happening, and I'm responding. So there is a conscious experience of choosing to respond, because I could say no, I
Yeah.
could pull away, but I'm not doing that. I'm allowing the pulling to happen, in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Hmm.
So that strikes me as, in some sense, kind of bringing, going back to the original kind of thing we were talking about, is like this thing that I can always ask a question about, right? It seems like part of the way that we know it's there, right? Is it's indistinguishable from it ceasing.
Yes, yes, that I would say that's
like
true.
it's because on some level, if you notice, people are probably, if anybody's watching this, they're probably like, what are we talking about again?
Yeah.
Right? Because we're actually talking about something that is not a thing in the normal. It's not an object,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
It's precisely and yet it not being an object, right? Is precisely discloses precisely what is so wondrous about it, right?
Yes. Yes.
Mhm.
And in this conversation, I feel it living through me and conversing through me. And there's a sense in which I can become aware of how much of me is present in this conversation and how much of it is present in this conversation. And at times it's very little me and mostly it. And
Yeah.
that is when the flow state seems to happen, is I'm just out of the way, and it is conversing on its own.
Totally. Can I ask you, if I were to ask you about this part where, so in some sense, because we met via YouTube, right? Like, I think that's like, you emailed me from the videos and stuff like that, and
Yes.
then
Yes.
you wanted to, you originally had this thought about like having me on your channel and just doing like an interview, and then you're like, well, actually, what about this the logos thing? How about we just do that? And I'm like, that sounds so much better.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, exactly.
And if you think about like, here, what's striking to me is, so here's this person all the way on the other side of the world, literally, right? um no no points of connection, right, that I am aware of,
Mhm.
and a billion videos, like a billion things that you could be paying attention to.
Mm.
It's something about this caught your attention,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And I would imagine, would you say, well, what we're talking about is the very thing that kind of caught your attention, was
Yes.
this thing that
Yes.
we're,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Exactly right. There are others that are attempting to untangle this mystery, and I'm attracted to those others. So John
Yeah.
Vervaeke is one of them. Jordan Hall is another. You're another. There are people that are grappling with this mystery and attempting to tell the truth about it in their own experience, and um explore together, and that is just so attractive to me. I find myself drawn to it, so I reached out
Yeah,
to you. Yeah.
yeah, totally. And I'm curious about, and I'm glad you did. I'm curious about the thing that, like, if there is anything that we're approaching, right, through these conversations and stuff like that, right? It's so interesting, because I had this conversation with a young man a few weeks ago, where he made it a point to really, he just wanted to stop and thank me, right? He's like, I just want to let you know, I don't know if you get this, but like, I think what you guys are doing is so important, and like, and it was so interesting, because I heard him and I was like, Okay, so really, and he was referring to the four ways, the number with John and Jordan
Yes,
and
yes, yes.
Christopher, those conversations specifically. And it struck me of like, I'm like, you realize what you're actually what you're thinking, right? Is you see four guys trying to, like, in some sense, trying to figure, like, I'm trying to describe or understand this thing that we can't quite put into words, but draws everything. And you're basically looking at four guys going, look at this, right? Do you see that? Look at this, 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 right? And it was so striking to me, right? From his perspective, there was kind of a stardom or something like that.
Yes,
And for
yes, yes.
just, it hit me in the sense of like, well, that stardom, right? Just, I want to let you know that the star that you think that you're talking to is just, if I'm a star, it's a star that's sitting there looking at a star trying to describe it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like there's something that, about this. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about how this, what is it about? And especially because, you are deeply in a practice and you've been doing this for a while.
Mm.
Is there something distinct that you're seeing out of these conversations, right? That a bunch of us are having, right? Around Via Logos.
Uh, so in the traditions of Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, and others, there is a concept of enlightenment, and there are practices to move towards enlightenment, and the Buddha laid out an eightfold noble path, which is great. That gives you some pointers to help you in that direction. What you guys are doing is co-creating in real time an ecology of practices that could be referred to and has been referred to as a religion that's not a religion. But it's not a doctrine of propositions. It's grounded in awe and wonder and mystery, and it's emerging now as we speak. And so, having had 5 years of grounding in a Buddhist spiritual practice, and I really, really value that, absolutely. And it is a path towards enlightenment. There's also this other thing that you four and others are participating in that is in service of the same thing. And there is something there's something inspiring about that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, everything that I call good in my life has this kind of quality, right? Where something speaks to me or something just beyond the horizon. I found and then I look, and then I never reach the horizon or really find, in some sense, the whole thing is like, just in some sense, it continually revealing what I think I'm interested in. And in the process, the whole ground changes and I change in a different place, and like, right. But it's got this quality of a receding, like the way a horizon recedes, right, as you move towards it. Yet not one that pushes back, not one that like keeps one out. It's more like it's a it's one that draws a kind of love, like it's a love, it's an affinity, it's a
Yes.
right, that quality, and all the stuff that has really been things that ultimately I have found lastingly valuable for me has these qualities, has that quality to it, right? This kind of mystery,
Yeah.
right? Yet in this way that's very much just like a horizon, right? Is gives the ground, right? If you don't have a ground, if you don't have a horizon, you just don't know where the ground is, right? Like, so there's this quality of where on some level it's unknown, yet it's the most, it gives, it orients to right where you are in some degree, right? And if that changes, my understanding of the ground changes, right? These, so this relational thing, and there does, and I think what I'm actually realizing, like I guess what I'm kind of getting close to and asking you about this is because I'm just kind of I'm constantly asking these questions like, well, what exactly are we? What are we doing here? And I not that I even need to know what we're doing. It's more like there's an in fact I bank that I don't know what I'm doing, right? But I do think that there is a sense in which what people are noticing and move towards, right, is showing something. And I don't know if it's the thing that's showing or if it's the way that loosely it's kind of developing, right, as something recognizable, right? You know, scare quotes around that. If it's if the novel thing is that's speaking to people, what would you say that it is? Because I got this sense of like the light itself on some level is what all human beings throughout all of history, right? On some level, it's the same light, if you will.
Yes. Yes.
What's the difference? If that's the case, what's the difference that caught your attention? That's been speaking to you around the conversations with John and Jordan and all those kinds of things, right? What stands out as different? Is it the method? Is it the medium? Is it the orientation? Or maybe it is a different light, right?
No, it's the same light. I'm quite certain of that. So I'm wrestling with something here because that's a question that provokes something in me. What's the difference? There is a way in which a spiritual master describes things from a place of knowing because they are a master and they have experienced profound states. They are experiencing profound states. So if you look at spiritual masters, my teacher Vishrant, Adyashanti, Muji, Gangaji, Eckhart Tolle, all of these people, they are all describing a state of being that a human can experience. And they are describing a methodology of how to get there. And you can ask them questions and they will give you answers to your questions and practices that you can help to foster that. You're doing something different to that. It's not that. You're not in a state describing the state and saying this is how you get there. You're not claiming anything. You're just participating in a conversation in a dialogos style. There is a way to describe dialogos as a practice, as a methodology.
Yeah.
You're using that as a tool, and you've done a lot of circling and meditation in your time as well. You've kind of honed your vehicle as a human being to be able to participate in these things, and you're participating in it from a place of not knowing, which is precisely the opposite of what a spiritual master does.
Yeah.
So there's a way of participating in it from a sense of knowing, and there's a way of participating in it from a sense of not knowing, and they're fundamentally different. So that's the thing that attracts me to you, is the way you participate.
Right. So it sounds like, it's fundamentally, the difference is participation itself, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That's really good to hear. It's really, really good to hear. Because in some sense, as we're talking about it, I'm realizing there is I'm just present to like so much of this. And I think I speak for John and all the people I've been talking to, is that it continually is a question of like, we're responding to something that we don't fully understand exactly. However, we find ourselves responding to it, right?
Yes.
And then listening to that, and
yes. And I see in John an attempt to create a framework. So he has conversations with Jordan Hall about the religion that's not a religion, and tries to distill what that is. And his series Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, it's 50 hours of let's look back at all the philosophical wisdom that we've accumulated up till now, and let's look at higher states of consciousness. Let's look at what enlightenment is. Let's look at divine double. Let's look at all of these things and unpack it. And then what impact does that have on addressing the meaning crisis from an individual perspective and from a collective perspective? So he's trying to do that in certain ways. Jordan's also attempting to do that in a different way with his Civium project. Like he's trying to think, what is the next level of civilization? And Game B also attempted to do that. You've created the Circling Institute, so you've created an attractor for people who are interested in this to come and participate in it and experience it. And who knows what comes out of that for each individual, right? So you all have frameworks and attractors that find the others. But still, having had that body of work and body of knowledge that you have behind you, you come to these conversations fresh, and you drop everything and you just participate and co-create in the moment, in what's emerging. And that's rare and special and attractive.
Thank you. It has me think or wonder, for you, if you kind of feel into your I don't know if you call it like your draw into it, into the conversation, right? And everything that you're up to. Is there a your way, right? Is there a your expression?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question yet. Possibly. What I am doing right now is I'm a trained counselor and I'm a trained Tai Chi teacher. Interesting, the parallel with John there, because he also is an experienced Tai Chi teacher. And so for me, I don't do as much Tai Chi as I used to, but I really, really invested in the counseling right now. And that counseling for me is a vehicle to practice selfless service of others, and to, in a way, I love the concept of agape, like the love that is intending to help grow and lift. Like counseling for me can be a practice of agape for an individual. And through that counseling process and interacting with individuals and attempting to help them solve problems about their life, there is an emergent style, I guess you could call it, that is me. But in terms of like a project or a framework, there's nothing really tangible for me right now. That's not to say that nothing will emerge over the next, I don't know how long, right? But so that is the answer to your question.
And we listen together. I think what has me ask the question is like, I sense something is emerging, like for you. Like I sense that there's a call, right? It's like it's almost like I hear the phone ring, and I'm like, is that for you?
Yeah. I sense that too. Yes, I sense it too, and I'm trying to listen as closely as I can, and go where it's asking me to go. And where it's asking me to go is often scary and uncomfortable and painful. but, but I'm attempting to go there anyway because it's like to not go there would be like in a way blasphemous or like it would be wrong in some way. So I'm attempting to serve that as best I can.
Yeah, totally. What's the painful part?
The painful part is in looking at patterns that I have in my psyche and ways that I am in the world, and acknowledging and owning those things within myself. So that, and attempting to change those patterns that I see as unhelpful. And also it's the experience of pain body that can emerge when things get triggered, or pain will arise from time to time, and the choice is then to repress it and not feel it, or to allow the experience to be there as it is. And we were talking about openness before and vulnerability, and I feel like that's so key. And that is a practice of openness, to allow pain to be experienced and felt and to leave. So that can be painful, uncomfortable, scary from time to time.
Yeah. So it's like so turning towards the call, the phone's ringing, turning towards picking up the phone. It also, what I'm hearing you say is it fair to say it's like by virtue of it all the different things that may be in the way.
Yes, right? Yes, absolutely.
Like show up in relationships, and they're very close in things. They're very personal, like things like you can get triggered about, and very confronting.
Yes. So for example, I had an argument with my wife the other day, and in that I get to see the ways in which I show up in relationship with my wife in an immature way, in a way that's selfish, and in a way that is serving my own agendas, and in a way that is childish. And that's confronting, because I want to be a man and a good husband in my marriage. And if I'm not showing up in that way, and I'm aware of that, that can be painful. So I then can choose to ignore that, or I can choose to try and process some of that and work on it. And I'd much rather at least attempt to process and work on it, even if it is painful.
Yeah. And for a second there, when you were talking about, I think you said something being childish with your wife, I was like, you've been talking to my wife?
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Right. I was like, who are you talking about? Oh, you're not talking about me? Oh, okay, gotcha. So there's something really there about this that I think that I'm appreciating is, and this is one of the things I've noticed in just circling, which is very relational, is it's like you can't far as I can tell, I don't think, for example, being relational, I don't think is a skill exactly, right? It's more like it's a capacity to be relational. And like there are communication skills and there's all those things, but however, I do know people that have gotten really good at those skills, but they don't have the capacity.
Yes.
And it's strange, you know. So there is a quality about with circling, and I think there's something about the Dialogos project, if you will, if you want to call it that. And I know John has done a lot of work around this preparatory, this sense of like you don't want to just jump into it because there's a bunch of things that you want to develop. That this, I think it's just inspiring to me that there's it inherently, I'm hearing myself kind of describe actually what the elements of a flow state, which is interesting, where what it'll take to have that conversation, if you will, is precisely to you being the person that could, right? Like there's some sense in which you can't just get good at it, right? Like to really be in it is to have your whole life in it in some sense, right? And so I hear that. I hear that, and I'm just really reminded of that experience and like how there's something about that like when you know that as you, I'm sure that you could probably have lots of experiences like this too, where you know in courses through the years, you know, when people get confronted or something like that and they want to leave, and we get down we have the conversation about them deciding whether or not to stay or to leave. Inevitably it's like it gets down to this like point where it's really clear that the very reason why they would leave is also the very reason why they would stay, right? It's like, oh, I want to leave because this thing is so difficult or scary, right? That's why I want to leave. Well, then why would you stay? Because this thing's so difficult and scary.
Yeah.
Right? There's something about that, those two things coming together that I think indicates it indicates that you got your finger right on something that, well, it's deeply significant, at least for you personally, right? Because it has to do with like levels of developing as a person, right? Like that's the quality of this. It's like to get good at this is to get good at being you, right? To get good at being you is about tripping over yourself, right? And then from that, dealing with that tripping over yourself, become even better at being you, right? This kind of back and forth, that faith that develops and trust, I think is what you said, in the process of that is incredibly, as I'm talking about it, it's like it's incredibly faith invoking for me.
Yes.
And encouraging. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's been my experience.
Really good talking with you, my friend.
Yeah, it's really good talking to you too, Guy. Absolutely.
Yeah, let's do more of this.
I would love to. I would really love
to. Yeah.